We're going to apply some of the skills that we've learned on the machine to a little project, making masks. It's a relatively easy thing to do for beginners and great way to practice your skills and come up with a product that you will actually use. To make a mask, you just need a couple different materials. Firstly, your fabric. A cotton or a linen is recommended. You really want 2 layers. I've chosen 2 different fabrics, so we have different on both sides. Nice patterned floral. This is like a quilting fabric. And then a plain one of the lighter color that I've picked out of the flowers. This is a calico. You'll also need some elastic for the ears. Nothing too thin so it doesn't dig in, or too thick so it becomes a nuisance. If you can't find any elastic, it's quite hard to find these days. Alternatives would be a hairband or an elastic band. If you're going to use an elastic band, I would recommend putting it in a casing so that it doesn't dig too heavy into your ears. Finally, I found the most effective masks have some sort of nose piece that will shape around your face. A pipe cleaner is a perfect tool to use. One pipe cleaner, and then you fold it to make it thicker and twist. Another option would be a twist tie, something that comes on like your bread. So just a different couple options there that you can get quite easily. So before you use your fabrics, you want to make sure that you've washed them. New fabrics will come with like a finish on, maybe starched, and you really want to wash all that away before you use them. Also, if you're working with something like a cotton, it's going to shrink, so it's best to pre-wash and get that shrinkage done, because if you make it and they don't shrink at the same rate, so if you're using 2 different fabrics, it's going to mess up your creation, and it's best just to get that shrink out of the way. I would also highly recommend investing in an iron. An iron's going to be one of your best friends when it comes to sewing, really help with the precision, and it's amazing the difference an iron makes working with the fabric and just making everything very neat. So the first thing we're going to do is cut out our fabric. We need 2 rectangles of each fabric. It's going to be a bit of trial and error for the sizing, as you want the mask to fit snugly but still cover your face. For myself, this was around 7 by 8 inches, and then you want to add on 1/2 inch all around for the seam allowance. Before you cut your fabric, you really want to make sure you're cutting along the grain. So fabrics are woven, and there is the selvage on the side. So if you have a new fabric, it probably still has this on the edge, and it'll be a nice straight edge. This is called the selvage. And this is the warp, and this is the weft. And if you look closely, you can see the woven. You can see the lines in here. Now the grain goes along these lines, and the reason you want to cut along the grain is because fabrics generally have very little give unless it's a stretchy fabric. So you can see there's slight give, but not very much. And if you don't stick to these grains, you risk being along the bias, which is the diagonal, and there is actually stretch. Even though it's a solid fabric, the bias creates a stretch. So if you don't cut it along the grain, it's going to affect your sewing. So if you have a new fabric and you have the selvage, this is the perfect place to start, because you know this line is going to be straight. So you would measure from this point the distance you need. If maybe you have just a scrap of fabric and you're not sure, some it's more obvious, the grain. If you want to make sure you have a straight line, there is a bit of a neat trick you can do. This doesn't work with all fabrics, but it does work quite well with something like a cotton. And what you do is you do a little snip in your fabric, and then you're actually going to rip, and it will rip along the grain. And then you have yourself a straight line to start off with, and then you would measure from this line. So I've marked out my square 9 inches by 8 inches, and we're just going to cut. You really want some fabric scissors and them to be sharp so you get a nice clean line. I really like the larger scissors because it makes for smoother cutting. Also, when you have your fabric scissors, make sure to not use them on any other materials like paper, because it will dull the scissors. Next, you want to cut your elastic. We're looking at around 8 inches, although again you might want to adjust depending on the fit. So you want 2 pieces of elastic, both 8 inches long. We're also going to prepare the pipe cleaner. So one pipe cleaner is a little too thin. If you fold it into 3, it's going to provide you with a good nose piece, and just make sure that you twist the ends in so that they don't irritate, because it can be a little pointy. So just pop it in, and then you want to twist it, and then twist it all together. And you've got your nose piece. So we're going to mark our fabric 1/2 inch for the seam allowance all the way around. Now I'm using a pencil so that you can clearly see the marks, but you'd normally use tailor's chalk. It comes in either a block, but these days you can also get it as a pencil. The pencil is much easier to use because it makes nice clean lines. As a beginner, I would recommend marking your seam allowances because it's going to help you in your sewing. You can use the lines on the machine, which is generally what I do, and once you become more practiced. So this is going to be our inside, and this is going to be our outside. For the calico, it's the same on both sides. For your other fabric, there is a right side and a wrong side. So obviously this is the right side, and this is the back side. So we're going to face the right sides together. And we're going to pin them together, but before we do that, we also want to place our elastic so that they are caught in the seam when we sew. So we want it on the shorter side. So obviously this is the longer side because it's the 9 inch. So we want it on the 8 inch side. And we're going to place it just below the seam allowance. And we're going to pop a pin in to hold that in place. And then we're going to pin the side. A lot of people will pin along the seam allowance like this. But what happens is when you sew, you often get the head of the pin caught. So I actually recommend putting the pins in the opposite way to what you're going to sew. So we're going to throw a few along the side like this. And then what happens is you can actually sew over the pins and they're not going to get caught. Or as you sew, you can pull out the pins easily. So again, make sure the heads are on the right side, so as you sew, you can pull them out. And we're going to take the other end of the elastic and pop it on the other end of that edge. Make sure it doesn't twist, so you want it to lay flat. So you've got that side pinned. Now it can be a little awkward because the elastic is the same size as the side, so it can just make it pucker a little bit. If it's easier, doing one side at a time is definitely an option. So you're going to repeat on the other side with your second piece of elastic, and then you're also going to pin these two sides. So we've pinned our two rectangles together on all the sides, and we've got our elastic pinned in there as well. And now we're going to go to the machine and sew all the way around the edge. We want to leave about 1 inch to 2 inches open on one of the shorter sides so that we're able to turn the mask the right way round. So you might want to mark that on. It's important to remember when you're sewing to not sew over the elastic by accident, so make sure that you keep it tucked inside. You can also maybe throw an additional pin in just to keep it away from where you're going to sew, otherwise you're going to have to do some unpicking. And now head to the machine. We have sewn our rectangles together and we've trimmed the corners. The next thing you're going to do is insert the nose piece. So you want to find the midway point on one of the long sides. The easiest way to do this is fold it in half and pop a pin in. The other option is to measure. You want to do the same thing with your nose piece. And then we're going to place it into the seam allowance. And we're going to secure with some pins. And then we're going to use our zigzag stitch and we're going to zigzag this into place. And you want to make sure that you remain in the seam allowance. We have zigzagged the nose piece into place, so it is nice and secure. Now we're going to turn the fabric the right way round, so find your hole and then push fabric through. A tip for when you're ironing out any of your seams is you want to use your fingers and you're going to roll the seam between your fingers so that you really get as close to the stitching as possible. And then you're going to hold it in place and take your iron and then iron out that seam. And just roll your fingers as you iron along. And with the reverse side slightly like a millimeter into the back, so that when you have it on the front side you can't see your lining. So as you can see, it's just like a millimeter rolled back, and roll it with your fingers. Another tip for getting neat corners is to take a pin and you can just bring out the corner, gently tease it out with a pin so it's nice and sharp. And again, use your fingers to roll that seam out. And just remember, you do have that nose piece in there, so it's just going to be a little challenging on that top edge to roll it out. For that one, you can always open it up like this, and the nose piece is on one side, so just use the tip and iron up against the nose piece. So we have a nice ironed rectangle, and what we're going to do is add the pleats in. So our finished mask is 7 inches long. We're going to do 1/2 inch each side. I'm just going to mark that with a pin. And then we're going to mark every 2 inches. We're going to do this on both sides. So the nose piece is going to go at the top, and we're going to have the pleats go down the mask. We're going to divide out this 2-inch area and fold it in half. And this would be about 1/2 inch between the pins then. And then we're going to take this pin and secure the pleat. And then we're going to do the same thing. We're going to take this edge and half it. And then one more time. And then you have your pleats, and we're going to repeat on the other side. We have pinned our pleats in place on both sides. You want to make sure that they match and that it still is a rectangle. We're then going to go over to the machine and top stitch them in place. You want to try and get quite close to the edge. This is where your movable needle can come in hand, because you can move it over to the right, and then you're going to be closer to this edge while still having the fabric under the presser foot. So you're going to top stitch. This will also close the hole on one of the edges that we'd left to turn it inside out. You can continue your top stitch along the long sides, again close to the edge on the bottom, just so that it holds the fabric nicely in place. For the top edge though, remember that the nose piece is in. What you can do is either sew a line of top stitching below the nose piece, or you can go close to the edge and then around the nose piece just to hold that in place. Again, with the movable needle, that's going to help so that the pipe cleaner stays out from under the presser foot, because if the presser foot goes over it, it's not going to be a nice neat edge. So we're going to go to our machine. You can top stitch in a color that matches, or an accent color to add something to your mask. Thanks for joining us for Sewing 101 and your first project.